There's a moment early on in Ghost of Tsushima where you're standing in a field, and instead of checking a map or following a glowing waypoint, you press a button and the wind just turns. It bends towards your next objective, dragging leaves and grass with it, and you just follow it. No compass, no minimap, no giant arrow floating over your head. That one decision, to guide players with wind instead of UI, tells you almost everything about why this game gets brought up 5 years later as one of the best open-world games ever made. Not because it reinvented the genre from the ground up. It didn't. It's still a Ubisoft-shaped open world underneath, if we're being honest. Clear a camp, free a village, climb a viewpoint. What makes it one of the best isn't the skeleton. It's that Sucker Punch took that familiar skeleton and dressed it in more intention, more restraint, and more genuine craft than almost anyone else in the genre has managed.
Before we get into design, it's worth knowing that Ghost of Tsushima isn't just set in a vaguely feudal Japan theme park. It's built around a real historical event, the first Mongol invasion of Japan in 1274, when Kublai Khan's forces landed on the actual island of Tsushima, which sits in the strait between Japan and Korea. Historically, the island's small samurai garrison was overwhelmed almost immediately. The game opens with that exact defeat. Jin Sakai's entire samurai contingent gets wiped out on the beach in the first act, and the story from there is built around a real tension in Japanese history. Honorable, direct combat versus doing whatever it actually takes to survive an enemy that doesn't fight by your rules. Sucker Punch's writers leaned into something that's often flattened in Western samurai media. The Code of Bushido wasn't some eternal, unchanging law. It was an ideal that real historical samurai constantly had to bend around the messy reality of actual warfare. Jen becoming the ghost, using stealth, poison, and assassination instead of standing and dueling, isn't just a gameplay unlock, it's the entire thematic spine of the story, traumatized as an internal war between Jin and his uncle, Lord Shimura, who represents the old, rigid version of honor. There's also a nice bit of poetic irony buried in the setting itself. Centuries after this invasion, that same historical wind that scattered Mongol fleets became the root of the word kamikaze, divine wind. Sucker Punch clearly knew that when they built their entire navigation system around wind.
This is the mechanic everyone remembers, so let's actually talk about how it works and why it mattered so much. Sucker Punch's coder Bill Rockenbeck broke this down at GDC in 2021. The wind system in Tsushima isn't some incredibly precise physics simulation. It's closer to a set of clever heuristics, particle systems the team internally called vorticles, tuned to prioritize how convincing the wind looked over how accurate it actually was. That's the whole trick. It didn't need to be real, it needed to feel alive. And the reason that mattered so much isn't just aesthetic. Creative director Jason Connell has talked about the actual design philosophy behind it. The team kept asking themselves how to keep players immersed in the world instead of staring at compasses and minimaps in the corner of the screen, so they stripped almost all of it away. No minimap, no quest markers cluttering your view. Instead, swipe the touchpad, a gust of wind rolls across the field, pointing you toward your objective, and you look up from the UI and actually look at the world you're walking through. It didn't stop at wind either. Foxes lead you to hidden Inari shrines. Birds fly toward points of interest. Columns of smoke on the horizon tell you where a burning village needs your help. No marker required. Every single one of these systems exists because Sucker Punch made a genuinely rare decision in AAA open-world design, trusting the environment to communicate instead of trusting a HUD to do it for them.
Here's a detail that tells you a lot about how self-aware this project was. Sucker Punch built an entire optional filter into the game called Kurosawa Mode, named directly after Akira Kurosawa, the director behind samurai classics like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. Flip it on, and the whole game shifts into black and white with a film grain, an aged film crackle in the audio, and the slightly narrower aspect ratio, deliberately mimicking the look of a mid-century Japanese samurai film.
Most games would bury something like that as a cute unlockable Easter egg. Sucker Punch shipped it as basically a second way to experience the entire game, and the huge number of players' first playthrough was in Kurosawa mode, specifically because it made the combat feel like you were starring in your own samurai movie. That's not a small production choice. That's a studio that clearly understood exactly which genre they were paying tribute to, and had the confidence to let players experience the whole thing filtered through that lens. And the combat backs that tone up. Ghost of Tsushima standoffs, where you and an enemy just stand still, staring each other down, and the fight is decided by a single perfectly timed button press, are directly lifted from the tension of a samurai movie duel. You could go your entire playthrough favoring stealth and never see them much, but the standoffs exist specifically because the game wanted at least one system that captured that slow burn, one cut decides everything energy of the films it was inspired by.
Something that gets undersold when people talk about this game is just how deliberate the audio work was. The audio team, led by audio director Bradley Meyer and senior sound designer Josh Lord, spent a huge amount of time researching 13th century Japan before they recorded a single sound effect. For the wind specifically, since it's such a central mechanic, they experimented with a bunch of source material and landed on recordings of an imperfectly played bamboo flute, because the slightly breathy, imprecise tone gave the guiding wind's audio a texture that could stand out from all the other ambient wind layered underneath it. At the time, this entire audio team was just 3 people. 3 people building a soundscape convincing enough that reviewers were specifically calling out the sound design as one of the game's best features. That's the kind of detail that doesn't show up in a trailer, but it's a huge part of where the game holds up on a rewatch or a replay. The world sounds considered, not generic. Ghost of Tsushima launched in July 2020, right at the tail end of the PS4's life, and became the console's fastest-selling new IP not tied to an existing franchise, 2.4 million copies in the first 3 days alone. But what's more interesting than the launch is what Sucker Punch did after. Instead of treating the game as finished, they added Legends, a completely free cooperative multiplayer mode built on the same world, with story missions for 2 players and survival-focused raids for 4, wrapped in its own folklore-inspired mythology separate from Jin's main story. Then came Iki Island, a substantial paid expansion that dug into Jin's backstory and pushed the emotional weight of the honor versus survival theme even further, adding a new region, a new supernatural antagonist, and some of the strongest side content in the entire game. Then came the director's cut, bundled it all together for PS5 and eventually PC. By the time you add it all up, Ghost of Tsushima crossed 13 million lifetime copies sold by late 2024, years after its original launch on a console generation that had already moved on. That's not a game that got lucky at launch. That's a game people kept coming back to. And now we've got real proof this wasn't lightning in a bottle. In October 2025, Sucker Punch released Ghost of Yotei, a spiritual successor set generations later with a new protagonist. And according to Sony's own earnings calls, it actually outpaced Tsushima's launch numbers, over 3.3 million copies in its first month alone, compared to Tsushima needing about 4 months to hit 5 million back in 2020. Sony's CFO specifically called it out as a major contributor to that quarter's financial results. That matters for this conversation because it means the exact design language Sucker Punch built for Tsushima, the wind, the minimal HUD, the standoffs, the cinematic filter, wasn't a one-time experiment that happened to catch on. It's now a proven formula the studio has successfully repeated, refined, and sold again at an even bigger scale, to an audience that already knew what they were getting into. Ghost of Tsushima didn't just succeed, it created a design language other games are now being measured against. So when I say Ghost of Tsushima is one of the best open-world games ever made, I'm not saying that because it reinvented the wheel.
The bones of it, the icon clearing, the region-based structure are honestly pretty familiar if you've played almost anything Ubisoft adjacent in the last decade. What makes it one of the best is everything Sucker Punch chose to do differently around that structure. A navigation system built entirely on atmosphere instead of UI clutter. A combat system that understood tension could matter more than spectacle. A visual mode that let you live inside the exact genre it was paying homage to. Sound design built by a 3-person team that treated a guiding wind mechanic like it deserved its own custom-recorded instrument. It's a game that took a formula everyone was getting tired of and proved the formula was never really the problem. The execution was. And 5 years later, with a sequel already outperforming it and the whole generation of players discovering Jin Sakai's story for the first time, that argument's basically settled. If you've never played it, honestly, this is a great time to start. Icky Island included, Kurosawa mode on day 1. And if you've already finished it, maybe it's time for a replay before you jump into Yate. If this kind of breakdown is your thing, subscribe for more, and let me know down in the comments which open world game you think deserves this same deep dive next.